All right. So, Chris, are you going to kick us off here?
I certainly can, but then I'll just hand it over to you guys to kind of run us through the conversation. Thanks everybody for joining. My name is Chris Tomio. I work for ECC, and we're excited to. It's an exciting time. We've got community consensus on a new dev fund for 1 year. Maybe Chris, I'll throw it to you to maybe talk through exactly what that is and what that means. But it was really a Herculean community effort. We had, a bunch of independent and disparate individuals and community groups who came together really to bring the discussion forward. That I think it was you, Jason, who actually kicked it off back in May of 2023. But it's a remarkable community achievement. So after a bunch of polling, a bunch of really good conversations, a bunch of really good debates in the forum, on social media, and elsewhere, I think we found that we found consensus. The voice of the Zcash community was clear on this next step. And while there is we're not done. The work isn't done, and what kind of like lies ahead of us is critical. But we're feeling, well, I'll just speak for myself. I'm feeling very confident that this community is ready to take it on. So, Chris Netticombe, if maybe you want to just talk about what this new dev fund is, and how we got here. Let's start there.
All right. So I guess maybe the first thing to do is back up a little bit and talk about the block subsidies in Zcash. So for the past 4 years, uh, Zcash block subsidies, which are used to introduce new coins into the ecosystem, and they're split. They've been split between miners who get 80% of the block subsidy, and a for the past 4 years, it's been three different groups. Zcash Community Grants has received the largest slice at 8% of the block subsidy. The Electric Coin Company received 7%, and then the Zcash Foundation received the remaining 5%. That arrangement is coming to an end in November, and so we've been engaged in this significant conversation to decide, is the block subsidy going to continue providing funds to the Zcash ecosystem for things other than network security, just securing the chain, and for development of both software development and community development, marketing, outreach, and so forth. So, as Chris said, Jason kicked off this discussion back in May. And so, over the past few months, largely on the Zcash community forums, there's been a significant amount of discussion around whether the dev fund should continue, and what possible forms it should take. There were ultimately 7 different proposals that were put forth to the Zcash community. And in a few rounds of voting, we gathered sentiment from, I would say, 5 or 6 different significant constituencies within the Zcash ecosystem. The first couple of rounds of voting narrowed things down to 2 proposals. And then there was a runoff between those 2 final proposals to choose what's going to happen going forward. So what was agreed on was essentially the next year of what happens with development funding. For that next year, the split between miners and ecosystem development will remain the same, with 80% of the block subsidy going to miners and 20% going to to development, but for the next year, the 8% slice to Zcash community grants will essentially remain the same, although instead of that slice being administered by the Zcash Foundation, it's going to be administered by the Financial Privacy Foundation, which is a Cayman Islands organization, but then distributed by the existing Zcash Community Grants Committee in the same fashion that previous grants have been made. And then the remaining 12% of the block subsidy is going into what we're calling a lockbox. And this is basically a balance in the protocol that we don't yet have a mechanism for disbursement. Because the previous round of development funding was coming to an end in November, we wanted to further decentralize how entities in the Zcash ecosystem were funded and not have the specific entities of the Zcash Foundation and the Electric Coin Company as direct recipients of funding from the protocol. But due to lead times for our hard forking network upgrades, there hasn't really been time to develop a fully new disbursement mechanism, grant funding mechanism that we could put into place. And so instead, that 12% of funding is going to be locked up until the community can come to consensus on a new mechanism, representative distributed mechanism for disbursement in presumably the form of grants to different ecosystem contributors. Jason, is there anything that I missed there?
I mean, that was an awesome summary. You covered pretty much everything. I guess a couple points that I had to is that a couple people mentioned that we in May of 2023.
Jason, you're breaking. Jason, you're breaking up a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just walk to the other room. I don't know.
Okay, let me see if I can. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, actually.
Yeah, it's a little better.
Okay, I literally just walked to the other room, so that helped. Yeah, so what I was saying was, so the difference between this time and the previous debt fund discussion is I feel like it took a while for things to heat up. Like Chris mentioned, we first started the conversation in May of 2023. Decentralist Dan and I were hosting a number of Twitter spaces, and we tried to really get the conversation started, but we were at the height of the bear market. ZEC was in the low 20s, and the community just sort of seemed apathetic. And then after that, there were months went by, and there were a couple proposals from people like G Guy, JGX, Noam Chom that sort of copied the direct funding structure. And from there, I think was around the time when Josh came in with his non-direct funding model, which was the Zcash funding block. And I think that really got people to start thinking outside the box. And one of the key things that wasn't present in the Zcap poll, but was present in the other polls, was this idea of whether or not the community prefers a non-direct funding model versus the traditional direct funding model that funds organizations instead of like a grants-based model that focuses on projects. And there was super strong consensus for this non-direct funding model. And that's when I think Skylar and Chris were the first to sort of think of this lockbox idea that sort of allows us to, instead of returning the block rewards to miners, put it into a protocol lockbox so that we can devise and figure out like the strategy involved in designing and implementing a disbursement mechanism. Yeah, so that's where we're at. I'm pretty pleased. I actually didn't expect the results to turn out the way they did. There was super majority consensus all in all for the hybrid model. I figured it was going to be split. So I think just one of the polls were split, the ZAC one. So it's good to see the community come to that consensus. And yeah, I think we've got an interesting next few months as we discuss how the funds will be dispersed.
Yeah, I have to say that despite it being a long process, I've been really pretty pleased with how things came together at the end. I mean, we have uh, very clear direction of what to do going forward, and now it's time to get to work on the next phase of figuring out how disbursement is going to actually work and what we want for funding individual entities in the Zcash ecosystem or individual projects in the Zcash ecosystem to look like going forward.
So what does that next phase
Yeah,
look
two
like?
significant things. I mentioned this on the Free to Z call, but I think it's important enough to mention again in this call is two things that I think we accomplished through this whole governance process was we made Zcash governance or community governance a bit more decentralized than it was before by having all these alternative polling. We had Jur, which Peacemonger was handling. We had Zach, which Josh was overseeing. We had the Helix poll for the Spanish community, for the Brazilian community. It was messy. It was sort of like chaotic, but in the end, it worked. So that was cool to see. And the other thing was that the community recognized that there is a problem with the direct funding model. It did not work as we anticipated, and it successfully, for lack of a better word, defunded the organizations, leaving some for ZCG to, funnel through to independent
Jason, I don't think we can
developers,
hear you.
and is now looking forward to implement the funding model. So I think that's a huge win for the community, and I'm really looking forward to see how the conversations progress.
Peacemonger, you were going to say something? Peacemonger? All right. I thought I heard Peacemonger ask uh, a question about what that next phase looks like, and the answer is that we don't really know yet. This is the time for the community to start talking about um, how we want disbursements from the M protocol lockbox to work. Whether we want a representative system. I know that Josh Swihart from ECC has previously proposed something called the Zcash funding block that identifies a number of different constituencies in the Zcash ecosystem that would be issued disbursement keys, and then there would be a multi-sig to disperse, probably with some sort of grants-based model. I think that there are other ideas that people have thrown around in the ecosystem, and now is really the time to, I think, capitalize on the momentum of this discussion, to settle on at least a first iteration of a disbursement model, because given the way that Zcash network upgrade timelines work, it's effectively effectively a year from now we'll be deciding again what to how development funding will continue for the following year or years. And I hope that by that time that we have some experience with this new disbursement mechanism that we're essentially starting design on now as a community, to see how a first iteration of that is working, and to determine whether that makes sense as a model going forward.
Chris, I'm curious, and Jason and Dan and Tatiana, is there precedent for this? Are there other projects that we can look to for, a roadmap, a pattern, a model?
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been funding discussions going on in all kinds of places across the cryptocurrency ecosystem. There's a lot that we can learn from. In particular, I recently picked up Kevin Owaki's new book, the On-Chain Capital Allocation Handbook. And that goes over a whole bunch of things that different communities have done along these lines. I'm pretty excited about some of the ideas of how retroactive funding has been done, particularly in the Optimism network, and there are some tools for that are being developed that in kind of a chain agnostic fashion that the Zcash community might want to look at. But I think that the thing for us to do now is, there will be sort of technical requirements for how disbursements from the lockbox can happen. And then there will separately be, social processes that we need to figure out for, how do people propose for grants? Do people propose for retroactive funding or proactive funding or a mix of both? There's a bunch of figuring out of that social layer that I think is really the important part, so that when it comes to the point of starting disbursements from the lockbox, that just like we were able to get pretty good community consensus behind this this change in funding model, I hope that we'll be able to get good consensus behind the allocation of funds.
If we wanted to do something like the funding block, where it's sort of like this DAO structure, where each entity holds like a multi-sig, what are the technical requirements for that, and sort of how long, what's the roadmap for implementation?
Okay, so the technical requirements there, I'll just kind of sketch them out at a high level. The first would be, so if it's a multi-sig, then it'll be, some protocol rules that say, given a signature from this set of, from K of N of these keys, it's possible to make a payment to some address. So that's it at the simplest level. Now, there are a bunch of questions that arise there. Some of them are, for example, do we want attribution? So do we need to be able to see, if you have these different keys, who voted for a proposal and who voted against it, and who abstained? We have to be able to decide on a mechanism for key rotation, so that the holders of those keys can be changed out over time. And the number of keys, for example, might also be changed, and those also would be things that would need to be implemented in at the protocol level. Those are kind of the big things. In terms of timeline, my vision for this is that this disbursement mechanism will probably be implemented only in ZBRD. So to avoid duplication of effort, just like Zcash shielded assets, which are scheduled to come into the protocol in Network Upgrade 7, which will be early next year. That's intended to be implemented only in ZBRD, and Zcash D will be deprecated and retired at the point of that upgrade. So similarly, for this disbursement mechanism, it would be implemented just in ZBRD, and I think that it would probably be implemented in a network upgrade that comes behind ZSAs, because putting both of those changes into a single network upgrade, there's just too much surface area for security problems to arise. We want to, Zcash has had a fairly conservative history of doing, we've made major changes to the protocol over time in hard forking network upgrades, but because we've been pretty cautious to try not to pile too much into a single network upgrade, we've been able to do so without significant security problems. And so that's kind of how I see things going. So my ballpark of what would be good, I don't know how feasible it is, would be a network upgrade that activates, sometime around the end of first quarter, or mid second quarter, of 2024 to actually add a disbursement mechanism and be able to begin getting experience with the disbursement process before we then need to make decisions about whether or not to continue with that sort of funding model.
Cool. And there's some ability. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, so there's some flexibility in how we potentially allocate that, meaning like after this hybrid proposal ends in November of 2025, we could, or even before then, we could implement something where like ZCG gets a slice, say 5%, 10% goes to the funding block, 3% goes somewhere else, 2% goes to coin holders, something like that. Wouldn't be off the table, right? So is it your...
Yeah, so
do you envision that sort of flexibility? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a possibility of for implementation, one lockbox versus n lockboxes. Once we have a distribution mechanism, that the decision of one versus n there is going to probably be made in the process of doing disbursement or the disbursement mechanism. Beyond that, then yeah, it's certainly possible for these slices to shift around over time to reflect the will of the community.
And I was just going to mention. Oh, I think Dan was going to say something, but before you do, Dan, this is a town hall, so if anybody has questions or feel free to raise your hand, and we can call on you. But go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Chris had said maybe end of Q1 2025 for the first iteration of some sort of disbursement mechanism. And I was just looking at some of the questions that were posted on the forum, and let's just say that maybe it was closer to a year after November, so November of 25. Like, obviously, hopefully we can get something out and start iterating on it before that. But Noam Chom had asked a question about the risk of the lockbox being underfunded. And so after about a year, he's saying that at this price, that the lockbox would have accumulated about $2 million at this price. He made a point that this isn't a ton of money for the entire ecosystem. And I just wanted to bring that up. In my mind, $2 million is a lot of money. It can go a long way. But I just wanted to make sure that this point was brought up since it was posted on the forum. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that. Or if it was earlier, to Chris's point.
I think it's a mistake to...
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jason.
No, sorry. There seems to be a delay in my audio, so I hope I'm not intentionally cutting people off. Yeah, so I think it's a mistake to think about it in terms of USD. Like, while it's definitely relevant, the point is it's 20% of the block rewards, right? So yeah, Noam's right. Like, that's $2 million. It sort of is what it is. Like, there's strong consensus around keeping the allocation of the dev fund at 20% of the block rewards. So
I don't know if you broke up there or what, but I was going to respond to the timeline question. So I think that if we don't have something like in place and functioning before next November, that it's going to be really hard to decide, what exactly to do, at that point. Maybe it will make sense if I guess I'd just be disappointed if we don't have something in place earlier than then, because this is, and I'll put this out there that this disbursement mechanism, Zcash is an open source project, and ZBRD is open source software. And if there's anything that I would think might be eligible for retroactive funding, it would be someone going and implementing a disbursement mechanism. In open source, we believe in loose consensus and running code, and I would love to see the community get a proposal for, okay, here's a PR or a branch that has a proposal for a disbursement mechanism, and for the person who makes that PR to or group that makes that PR to apply for and get retroactive funding for it. I mean, this is kind of the thing that we want to encourage in this process.
Yeah, I think in order for it to move along quickly, like, I don't want to underestimate like what this is a big effort, right? Both in terms of both technically and socially. So I think if we want something to happen sooner than later, then we need to start organizing groups and thinking about proposals like now, to get something done, if by early to mid 2025.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that the level of activity that we've had getting to this point, that we definitely need to keep that up, because it's both meant that we've had a lot of engagement of people in the ecosystem, and we've had a lot of good ideas come out from people in the ecosystem that have been incredibly influential in this process. And so, like, this is the right conversation to be having right now, and to start on question to people in the audience: what's important to you in the design of a disbursement mechanism?
Yeah, as Chris said, if anybody just raise your hand and Chris can bring you up. I'll check the chat too. If somebody isn't comfortable coming up, you can post, and I'll keep an eye there as well.
I don't see any hands at the moment. I'm curious from all four of you. This is a interesting. It was, I think people have called it like a messy process, but I think that that's part of the deal in this world, right? And in some ways, we like it that way. I'm curious from the four of you about maybe lessons learned in getting to consensus on this kind of dev fund 2, and what can we take into the next conversation, the next process, as we try to reach consensus on some other things.
I'll give it a go. I think Jason, I think, alluded to this, and I've heard him talk about it in the past. But getting started early enough, and actually, Chris Nuttycombe had mentioned this too, about getting things rolling, getting the ball rolling as early as possible, and iterating from there. And we saw that in 2020. It started much earlier than this time around, and as Jason said, we had some Twitter spaces early on. It sort of died out a little bit, and then things really started heated up as the community started putting things forward, right? And as the community voices their opinion and shares ideas, then people can agree, disagree, iterate on it, come up with a different variation, which happened this time around. There was a couple varieties that were similar, and so one thing I think is no matter what discussions need to be had in the future with the community, getting started as early as possible and encouraging contributions is one takeaway that I had.
Yeah, to build on that, like, I would like to see like the Zcash Foundation and ECC have less involvement and this be like a community run process, right? And it would be cool to see like Zec Hub and the Spanish community, the Brazilian community, the various communities with that make up Zcash to form their own groups and like brainstorm together, submit proposals, and usher the process through.
Just a real quick question. I think the move is kind of toward scalability and
I'm not sure if
granularity.
my audio is getting cut off, but
Oh yeah. Yeah, am I here?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so like technically and socially, how scalable do you think it can be? How granular do you think it can be? How continuous do you think it can be? Like, on the extreme outside, could there be 1 million voters? Could people, have weekly check-ins for, more continuous funding? So that's like the exact opposite of just giving, like one organization the whole thing for 4 years. But how far technically and socially might it be in the other direction where, really small contributors and, massive vote consensus kind of thing, hopefully I'm not cutting off, but yeah, technically and socially, how far out could we go in that direction?
So I think that this is going to be an incremental process, right? So I think that technically, the designs that the protocol teams have been discussing thus far might scale to like, tens of keys being distributed. But a really important thing is quorum, right? Size of quorum, at least for the kinds of designs that we've talked about thus far that are multi-sig designs, and what it takes to achieve quorum. Because I think that at least early on, there's likely to be a scenario where we're going to want K of N participants, and if we can't get K of N people to pay attention, then that could cause problems and just sort of stall the whole process. As far as what designs are possible, I don't know. I mean, let's throw out some ideas and come up with them for how we might scale larger. But I think that for this year, I would say that we can probably scale to to tens, and maybe that's the first step. And then maybe a couple of years now we see, okay, can we come up with a way to scale to hundreds?
Interesting. So at the top level, to get to thousands and millions, it'd have to be, sub DAOs or, like aggregation of different kind of, stakeholders, interest groups, whatever. But yeah, just thinking out loud, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at all kinds of elections worldwide, right, getting a significant constituency to vote is often problematic, and maybe in the blockchain space especially, we have to deal with Sybil resistance, which is an extremely hard problem. I mean, if you look at Gitcoin as a good example, right? Gitcoin went to implement quadratic funding, and they implemented the quadratic voting part of it in I think it was a few months, and then they went on to spend years working on Sybil resistance, and so that's where just when money is involved, you have these kind of game theoretic problems that you have to cope with, that I don't think that the industry as a whole has come up with great answers to yet. And in that respect, I think we want to be, perhaps somewhat conservative, to, in the Zcash world especially, we are always thinking adversarially and thinking about, okay, how do we have a model? All right, now how do we exploit this, right? How does someone come along and break the model of consensus that we're trying to achieve? And so that's going to be really important in this governance process, is thinking adversarially, figuring out how it can be broken, and then making sure we have defenses against those attacks. And so that's why I think that approaching the problem incrementally is the right choice here. I'm personally a big fan of kind of networks of trust, and there might be some really interesting things that can be done there with respect to delegation, but it's a hard problem, especially at the social layer. And the more that you want the hard problems in the social layer reflected in the protocol, the more complicated the protocol gets.
Skylar, are you still up here? On the topic of
lost in
Sybil. Okay, Sybil. I saw you posted 2 write-ups on quadratic funding and Sybil attacks. Did you want to add anything in relation to?
Well, I mean, yeah, I have some ideas brewing, but they're really early, and I need to build the background for myself. And I figure, there's these kind of like, fundamental foundational things to consider, which, I mean, just, I don't know if it's just coincidence. I think Chris mentioned civil resistance and quadratic funding, and just to kind of flesh out my own understanding. And then, I'm kind of like maybe building toward a bigger idea, but I like, I like kind of pilots, the idea of pilots, but thinking about how to actually do that on chain in the network upgrade life cycle, because I live day to day in a more deploy 100 times a day web life that I live, so it's a whole different problem to think about on chain. So I'm kind of struggling with it, with like protocol and on chain stuff. But I mean, they're hard enough problems to solve. But then we all, we there's things that we care about a lot that make it a lot harder to solve, like privacy. If we took a blood sample from every voter and created a huge centralized database of all their data, and did a retina scan or something, or but can that be solved with zero knowledge proofs on the other hand? So I'm probably too lost in thought to be speaking.
Well,
Moving my mouse around.
I will throw a couple of things out there. So we do have one existing civil resistant mechanism that was actually used as one means of gathering sentiment in this last voting process, which is coin holder voting. And we can do coin holder voting. We can do it preserving privacy, and we can even do it where, for example, the weight of a vote is proportional to, say, how long a set of coins has been present unspent in one of the pools. So it's possible, for example, to say, okay, for this output that I have, this UTXO, this note, I can prove that a year ago I was holding it, and I can prove that I'm still holding it now, and that it's been unspent for that whole time. So that is the one thing that we have. Now, that doesn't solve anything with respect to quadratic funding, because people can just split up the notes and keep them in whatever denominations they want. But that is a civil resistant path, and so I think that that's going to be inevitably a part of future sentiment gathering. And I think that that's valuable, because the coin holders ultimately have a kind of a delayed action veto over the future of the Zcash protocol, because if they're not happy with it, they can sell. And I would like for them to have a more proactive role in saying the market being able to express its sentiment about a proposed change before the change happens. Now that requires engaged coin holders, and you have the same problems with voter engagement as everywhere else. But I floated on the forum the idea that maybe a way to approach this would be some sort of proactive approach to approving grants, but have, for example, a coin holder veto, because that kind of thing could be a way for the market to signal, okay, this is a change that's been suggested and that has been proposed for funding. But if the market doesn't like it and wants to signal that, the market is not going to like it in terms of coin price going forward, then maybe there's a weight. Maybe there's a balance between proposing changes and vetoing changes.
We have another hand up if we want to transition to another question here. Adventure?
Yeah, please.
Adventure says. Adventure Sense, you have a microphone. if you want it.
Maybe just
Can you hear me?
yeah,
Can you hear
go
me
ahead.
now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to compliment you all on the great work that you're doing. And this is my first time being part of this sort of forum for Zcash. And I just wanted to encourage all of you to find a way to move more quickly if you can. You know, you've got all sorts of other projects out there innovating with zero knowledge proofs. And I think what you guys have done is wonderful and important. And I would just encourage you all to find a way to move more quickly because you've got extremely well-funded alternatives out there like zk-snark and StarkNet. And I would really love to see you guys find a way to implement quantum resistance and smart contract capability soon. So I get that you guys want to be careful about what you're doing and methodical about it and do it right. But I would just encourage you to find a way to increase your velocity because the world really needs Zcash and authoritarianism is on the march. And so I don't think we have an endless amount of time here to get those things done.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. You know, the reality is right now, in terms of people who are working on the protocol and wallets and whatnot, it's a very small pool of developers, and we go pretty flat out. And so, you know, the biggest thing that we need here is for other folks in the ecosystem to take part and move things forward so that it's not all on you know, currently the developers at ECC and ZF and then a few outside groups who are doing wallet development. You know, there's just not a lot of engineering time when you come right down to it.
Has there been any consideration for ways you could get your hands on more capital to increase the velocity?
That's a question not for me as an engineer, but for folks like Josh Swihart and Dodger from the Zcash Foundation. And I guess Jason, you can maybe, you know, with Shielded Labs, you can maybe give an answer to that.
Yeah, so Shielded Labs is a donations-based organization. It's small, you know, but I think that, you know, it speaks to the fact that the other organizations within the Zcash ecosystem should definitely like reach out to see if there are other ways to obtain funding. I think that's a great point, and I think it's something that all of the organizations, including the ones that are recipients of ZCG grant funding, should consider.
Well, and there's such a great opportunity, you know, right at the beginning of the bull market here. Such a great opportunity to stand out. Thanks.
So,
Thanks for letting me speak.
thanks for jumping up. I saw Triple Uwu had, just to pivot, Triple Uwu had posted in the chat another question, if you guys are okay with pivoting here. Given all the potential moving parts, is there consideration of developing a somewhat fail-safe option? And then, you know, before I toss it to whoever else on the panel here, and maybe others would disagree with me, but I sort of feel like the hybrid model and ZCG staying direct funded it could be viewed at, or at least in my mind, as a sort of fail-safe option. And maybe there's others, or maybe John was alluding to something specific, but yeah, I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, okay. So there are a few different ways that we can look at that. So there, and I think there are several fail-safe options. To start with, I absolutely agree that seeking other sources of funding, and, you know, I'm a big, you know, I've been in startups for years and I really like seeking profitability. that or seeking self-funding options. I think that, regardless of how disbursement with the dev fund goes, that's probably going to be not just desirable but necessary for all of the organizations involved. Um, so, but so that will provide one sort of fail-safe. Um, in terms of the dev fund itself, there are a couple of different fail-safe options. As as Dan just alluded to, having the ZCG slice in place provides, a small fallback. A more significant but readily implementable fallback is, if, for example, the ZCG slice needs to be increased so that they can do more grant funding because the disbursement mechanism development can't progress as fast as it needs to. That kind of change the protocol is at least easy to implement. And then the third thing, when I think about fail-safe, something that, with respect to a new disbursement mechanism itself, that I want to see is, I do think that there should be some sort of, I call it an e-stop. So I do a bunch of machine work, machinist work as a hobby, and any machine that might have the potential to hurt somebody has an e-stop button on it, and I think that the disbursement mechanism will probably need some sort of built-in e-stop, so that if there is compromise or capture or whatever, that it's possible to kind of put a halt on that disbursement mechanism until humans can come in and sort out what's going on. So three different levels of fail-safe there. Did that capture the question?
I think so. Yes. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, and for the second one, I'll just add that although the hybrid proposal is being implemented for up to a year, like at any point in time, somebody can propose a zip. Like there's no like timetable or structure to it, to change the allocations or increase ECG's funding, as Chris mentioned. So that's definitely always an option.
Yeah, so that's a great point. We don't have, especially for the zip process, there is no, we don't have to wait for anything. And then once we have a zip that checks all the boxes in terms of network security and so forth, implementation can start when somebody has the idea and the time to work on it.
I'd be curious to hear, if we have more time, I'd be curious to hear, like, if we could run through a case study of how something like the Zcash funding block would work. Like one thing, like just understanding everything from the time somebody proposes an idea for funding to like when it's funded, and how consensus is made. If anybody can speak to that.
I mean, I see that Josh, who proposed it, is listening here.
Yeah.
Maybe Josh, you want to come up and speak to that?
If you do, Josh, I've just invited you.
Maybe while we're waiting on Josh, if he decides to come up, Noam had also said similarly to this, what on the forum, what frequency will we anticipate individuals to be making proposals? Asked a different way, how frequently do we expect the Lockbox signers to be collectively reviewing or signing grant requests? I just wanted to throw that out there since it was related and asked in the thread.
Okay, so I don't have, I can't speak to the proposal, but I do have an opinion here, which is that when I look at the amount of effort that it's taken the Zcash Community Grants Committee to do the, all of the mechanical stuff of, reviewing grants and so forth, I think that there probably will be a need in the Zcash ecosystem for there to be some sort of dedicated body that could be the Zcash Community Grants Group, or it could be some other group of interested individuals who take the time and are probably compensated to do some of that work, because there is a ton of work that goes into preparing, just making proposals actionable. So even in this last process of proposal and whatnot, the zip editors ended up having to do a lot of work to make the proposals that were put forward things that were clear enough that they could be voted on and actionable. So there's definitely a role for some group to have that responsibility and be compensated for it. So I would see, a group of that nature, could start with ZCG or somebody else being, the ones who would, organize how proposals are announced and organized and tracked, and then essentially get them into a position where they could be brought to a vote for funding. And I'm personally hoping that there will be a mix of some things that are funded purely retroactively, some things where I've suggested a mechanism whereby community sentiment could be gathered and proactive funding could be raised in a form of loans from community members, where those loans would then eventually be repaid by retroactive grants. I think there are a lot of interesting possibilities there, but I think it's going to be, to answer Noam Chom's question, I think it's going to be an ongoing process. I think there's going to have to be, some group of people who are continuously involved in doing this work, because there's just a ton of that work to do. And as far as the question about signers go, I doubt that the signers will be able to sort of meet and make decisions less than once a month, but maybe every couple of months. That kind of cadence, this is something where we also kind of need to learn from by trying it out, what kind of cadence makes sense, because I don't think that we can just guess that and get it right up front.
So
I got called up to answer a question, but what was the question exactly? It was how would it work?
Yeah, the question was essentially what does the process look like with something like the Zcash funding block, from sort of proposal through disbursement?
Yeah, and I'm having a few people kind of look at it, putting out a revision based on community feedback, by the way, in a little bit more detail on how some of this might work. So hopefully that will be up in the forum before not too long. And it's intended to be a starting place for a conversation, because there's kind of these interesting nuances. But to answer these, to answer that question, the idea being that there's a place like there is today where grants can be submitted. This, as it was envisioned, it would start with effectively two funding pools, and one funding pool is for smaller grants up to some threshold, let's say $100,000, and then major grants are a different pool. And because of smaller grants, that can be more agile. There can be a group that has responsibility for reviewing those grants and funding those grants. And so, a logical place for that, kind of at the outset is like something like ZCG, the Zcash Community Grants, who are able to meet frequently and who are compensated for reviewing those grants and making those approvals up to some threshold, again, on a per grant level, as well as as a funding pool level, because they get a certain percentage that's funded to that pool. The larger grants then the way that it's designed is not that there would be a committee. They would not be a committee. They would be constituents, and they would represent different constituency groups. So a constituency group might be a DAO like ZecHub. A constituency group might be coin holders. A constituency group might be, ECC or ZF or Shielded Labs or other kind of long-standing trusted folks within the ecosystem that can that has responsibility. If you're holding one of the keys, you have a responsibility for watching that queue and responding in a timely way. And so you watch that queue, and then you may have different mechanisms for gathering sentiment within your constituency group. So coin holders may be a vote, the DAO may be a vote. ECC may survey its ZAC community and say, you think this is a good idea, or do some technical due diligence on it as well to see if it's even feasible, and to provide feedback and interact with the grant recipient. Ultimately, then, when that constituency group is comfortable, then it votes. And it's not synchronous, it's asynchronous. So it votes by signing, or it votes by some, it could be signing, it could be a governance token, it could be whatever kind of mechanism gets designed. And then when a certain threshold is met, then funding is released. And so in the proposal I put out, it's for funding, it's a majority, simple majority. Once that threshold is released, the proposal's out, then it's approved. And that approval then is contingent upon some milestones. So when the milestone is met, then the signer has the responsibility to then sign again and say, okay, this milestone has been met, and then the funds get released to the grantee. This also could work for governance, and so I go into a revised proposal as well, where you can add or remove people that have keys that are able to make these approvals. I say people, but constituency groups through a governance process, and the governance process is a little bit more not onerous, but it requires more of it like a supermajority to make a decision rather than a simple majority. So that's the basics of how something like that would work.
So we are up at almost an hour here. So just to be sensitive to people's times, maybe if there are any more questions, stick your hand up. If there's anything that you hosts, you speakers want to wrap up with, I think now would be a good time to start going that way.
I'll just say thanks everybody for being here, and shout out to Vito for pushing this along and getting it scheduled. And I was happy to participate. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This has been great.
Thanks for doing this. We're going to have more of these, right? Because there's a whole bunch of proposals come out. It'd be great if you guys continue with this process, and as proposals hit, and we have more of these kind of conversations where there is often a lot of nuance and that kind of thing, that we can hash these out on these calls and in these public forums. So fantastic. And yeah, thank you, Vito, for organizing this.
Okay. Thanks all. I know Tatiana was dying to speak, and she had some technical difficulties here. So we'll have to schedule another one soon so she can get her words out. All right. Thank you all. Have a great day.